If we can now see as many panels and questions up there as we can and see if we can extract as much knowledge from their experience and their expertise that they've built up, please. So, anyone like to kick off? I want to help with the paddles, guys. Come on, thanks. Right, we're on deer here, it would appear. How many people are required to manage deer then, Geoff?
I suppose it depends on the outcome that you want. There are some stats that would suggest that enough deer are being culled in the UK to keep the population stable. But obviously there is also evidence that impacts are still occurring. So it's difficult to put a number of people on it because so much of deer management is done by recreational deer stalkers and deer managers. It's very difficult to say X number of people are required to carry out deer management because we're still not 100% sure exactly how much and what deer management needs to be done. A recreational deer stalker might shoot 2 deer a year or 3 deer a year, but if you've got 245,000 people that are doing that, it adds up. So that it's probably impossible to say we need X number of people to manage deer, I'm afraid.
We'll start with number 5, please.
Tony Pexton, 75 scholar, 1975 by the way. A question or a point really to Teresa in that my grade contract says that the grain will have no insects in it. Therefore, it's a high risk proposition to risk having insects in that grain that I deliver because of rejection. This surely is an example of how we've got to be talking right through the supply chain. It's not just a decision that you or I make, it's a decision that the whole supply chain has to make. And I'm not just obviously talking about bugs in my grain, there are all sorts of issues about supply, sustainability of supply, seasonality and everything else.
I completely agree, and I think it is that whole supply chain working together, and I think that's why that concept of risk is actually really interesting, and actually having that discussion about risk. I don't think we often do that. You know, you might have a conversation with your grain bioagronomist and say, my level of risk is I'm not prepared to tolerate any insects in my grain, and so I need to have an effective control of that. But it might be, for example, with an agronomist in your field, you might be prepared to accept a certain lower level of yield or weeds or, you know, a certain level of pests, but actually not have to use that insecticide that might have other kind of, you know, detrimental effects. So I think that's why that concept of risk, when we're thinking about changing practices and having that discussion, being prepared to think about what our appetite is and what our tolerance is really important. And I think if we don't have that discussion, an agronomist might assume what that grower thinks, and a grower might assume what that agronomist thinks, you know, and then we're not moving forward. So I completely agree. You know, we need to set our levels of risk for each stage of our our life cycle, and we need to think about that as a supply chain in order to move forward. Yeah.
David, do you want to contribute to that? Because bugs in grain is the same as specks in apples. You know, are the customer prepared to put up with more, with a lower grade for a biological solution?
No.
Well, can I counteract that? Because that was really interesting, actually. At Door Creek Orchard in the States, and I show you they've got this wonderful thing about eating ugly fruit. And their consumers in Madison, which they say is very open, they're educating them and saying, by not using these, some of these insecticides, your fruit might look a bit blemished, and it might have kind of dots, and it might have things, but actually, you know, it's being grown in an environment that's supporting pollinators or monarch butterflies in that environment. So perhaps it is that consumer perception that we need to challenge and, you know, and change. But your experience is different, yeah.
No, in my experience, customers just want the nicest looking, nicest tasting fruit, and they're very, very picky and very, very fussy.
Number 4, please.
Thank you. Walter Simon, 2002 scholar, also a paddle waver, so it's quite nice to be able to not have to wave somebody else. Teresa, for you really, IPM, we see it in Red Tractor, it's talked about a lot in there, it's talked about a lot in Leaf. There's the VI initiative from the NFU and the VI champions. What messages do you have for those that they can do better?
I think what I'd like to see, and what I've realised through my travels and the conversations, is that in order to get that uptake, we need to do more than just write it into a road tractor standard or just talk about it, you know, in Leaf. We need to do each of those areas, particularly the voluntary. So maybe we're talking about IPM, but maybe we don't know what we mean by IPM. And I've certainly been on a journey and learnt a lot from the horticulture, you know, laying hen, you know, animal livestock sectors about IPM. So I think we do need a balance between education. We say we're doing IPM, but are we actually? Perhaps on a scale of 1 to 10, probably in the arable sector, maybe we're only about 2 or 3. There's a long way to go. So I think training, investing in training, I think having the support out there in terms of what practices are there and how far we can go. Like I say, having the incentives, you know, and realising some of those benefits that are more qualitative rather than quantitative, and having the tools. I don't think we have enough funding into really kind of the future practices at the moment in terms of our sectors. So, yeah, I think, yeah, there's a fair bit that we need to do across all of those sectors to fully understand. And I do actually wonder whether we should call it IPM. I do wonder if we should have a different term, maybe field health, maybe, or something like that that encompasses more than just specific there as well.
Yeah. David, can I ask you the question that's up there about the pollinators and how that's benefited you commercially? Has it?
In a way, yes, because I've reduced my chemical, especially insecticides, usage by about 15 to 20%, but the value of everything else has gone up by over 30%. So in a financial sense, no, but in theory, yes.
Question up here, too.
Hi, Kate Main, 2018 scholar. Geoff, a lot of the development of ELM, Future Environmental Land Management Schemes, is about landscape connectivity. It's about big areas of habitats being connected. I'm just really interested to know, how do we deal with deer in that sort of context if we're looking at large-scale biodiversity development? And is deer management being properly focused on in amongst this conversation?
So I think it needs to be dealt with in the same way, in that it needs to be dealt with on a bigger scale, on that landscape scale. Yes, deer are being discussed in that. There's been a recent deer management consultation, which was nice because it sort of indicated me doing a Nuffield scholarship on deer. That's come out since I've been doing my study. So there are plans and conversations going on about the management of deer, locally and sort of nationally. I had some conversations quite recently with Lincolnshire County Council, who have a big tree planting scheme, and they are considering what they need to do to, you know, manage the impacts of deer on those what will be newly established trees that would be very, very vulnerable to deer. So the conversations are going on. But yeah, the bigger scale, multiple adjacent landowners looking at it together will really make a difference, because if you do it in a silo, it just doesn't, it isn't impactful and has the potential just to fail completely.
Hi, Gordon Rennie, 1994, scholar. On the deer management thing, my scholarship was to New Zealand, and I'll keep going back there, but the Kiwis farm venison to an incredibly high standard. So my friends who sell venison in Britain, they prefer to import farmed New Zealand venison because the standard is consistent. So, and the other thing I'd like you to comment on, when private, very wealthy Scandinavian people buy huge tracts of the Scottish Highlands, then stick up miles and miles of deer fencing, could have an adverse effect on the migration of deer.
So if we tackle the deer farming first, yeah, New Zealand is the birthplace of deer farming, without a doubt, and it was something that I was originally going to look at as part of my Nuffield study. Would it at least give us a head start on the issue if we just caught a load of deer and had more deer farms in the UK? And I, through conversations with fellow Nuffield scholar in my cohort, Dan, and a bit of reading around the subject, went away from looking into that and having had conversations with people in New Zealand since. Although, yes, it means they have this booming deer farming industry and can produce very high quality venison, just as UK deer farms produce excellently high quality, consistent venison. It hasn't really been a final sort of solution to the deer management issue over there. It made sure that they had sustainable venison production, but now the wild deer issues have returned. So it hasn't solved that. Yeah, you'll always have that. Farmed venison will always be more consistent, have an easier route into supermarkets than wild shot venison, and therefore be more appealing to a consumer than wild venison. We do export about a third of the wild shot venison in the UK to Europe. So yeah, consistency-wise, if you were picking between wild venison and farmed venison, the farmed venison would potentially be the better product on a supermarket shelf. But as part of a management strategy, I don't think it's going to help in the UK. And you know, wild venison is still delicious. You might just not, you know, you might have to be looking at different outlets for it, and that there are efforts to smooth that supply chain at the moment. There's a lot of work on reducing the use of lead ammunition. So a lot of stalking is now done with non-toxic ammunition, copper, for example, so that wild venison has an easier route into sort of supermarket food chains. Sorry, the other part was fencing. So, yeah, so effective physical boundaries will stop deer moving around, although if they really want to get there, in my experience, they will find a way. You know, I've seen deer jump very tall fences or go through them or under them or swim around them or whatnot. So we don't really have, you know, thousands of years ago when we still had native reindeer, they would migrate from Doggerland up to the Staffordshire Peak District. So we're talking hundreds of miles. We don't have those long distance migrations in the UK within deer populations anymore. So it's not going to stop anything like that. I mean, the idea of fencing bits of the uplands makes sense. I've got another photo, I didn't think to share it, but of a fenced, it's in the southern uplands where there's a rewilding project. Deer are fenced out of it, and you can see straight away the biodiversity is much better where they're fenced out of than where they have access to. So it serves a purpose in reducing their impacts. It will stop them moving around, but not in any sort of really negative way.
Okay, number 6, time's going on, so that might be the last question.
Tim May, 2011 scholar. I just had IPM and regenerative farming described to me as an ideologically, I know what I mean, as an ideal thing and a bit of a dream as opposed to a reality. What would your response to that be?
Sorry, I was distracted by carry on.
I did wonder about that when I was listening to Robert's talk this morning, and whether I might get asked that question, having put my presentation together. I think we need to move forward. We need to challenge what we're doing and look at solutions to growing food and supporting the environment going forward. And I genuinely think perhaps the best ideas start as an ideal, and then we put the research and put the agronomic science to them in order to enable the tools behind it. And from the practices I saw, certainly in horticulture for roses, for example, in Kenya, their certification schemes to sell roses into the Belgian markets, to come into our supermarket stores, is now dictating that you can't use all of these active ingredients that would be known to all of us. And so they've got problems with pests, with diseases, that they're having to find a biological alternative. In some ways, the thought that we might not have access to those chemicals maybe is an ideological idea, but actually I talked to Vanessa about if we bring some of those unknown or known unknowns into our risk matrix and bring them into that, then we start thinking about it going forward. So perhaps some of it's ideological, perhaps there will always be pesticides, there will always be genetic engineering in the future, but if there aren't, perhaps we should start putting some of the research and tools into practice now to enable us to have that more resilient future.
Anyone else want to contribute to that?
Yeah. I personally think that the future holds a combination between chemicals. I think gene editing in fruit farming especially has got to have a part in the future because that can solve so many issues, and biological. I think we need to find a blended mix of all of them. One is not going to do the job. You've got to have a blend.
That's a good balanced finish to the session. But yep, so we'll go through the presentation of the scribes. And then we will have 10 minutes break, so very quickly, if anyone needs refreshment, we need to be back here and keep the job moving forward. So thank you very much for your attention and your questions, and a round of applause for our presenters.